There's this house, right? And it's like a horse farm kind of house. It's on the corner of Callow Hill and Branch Road in Percy, okay, in Percy, Pennsylvania. And from what I understand, this guy has some, or this family or whatever, has some kind of standing in the in either, like, the Bucks County GOP, or the the Penridge GOP, whatever it might be. And he's got these, those white fences that go around horse farms. And on that corner, every time there's an election that's brewing, right, you can count on this dude from kind of like nailing up these 8x10 sheets of plywood with some kind of like the latest kind of right-wing messaging that they're going to use to drive kind of white voters to the polls, right? And I've been waiting for it, right? There's a sign that went up last week. It's just kind of like a painted American flag that says faith, family, freedom, right? As you'd expect, faith, family, freedom, like, the three F's that we all learn in school: faith, family, freedom. Right. So, but I've been waiting. It's okay. Well, that can't be it, right? Because that faith, family, freedom, whatever. That's just not going to drive kind of that's not going to get the frothing going, right? That doesn't kind of put the fear of zombie hordes rushing at you in you, right? Right. So, what happens here is that now the two other signs on either side of the flag go up, right? And one says values, beliefs, identity, taught in home. Academics taught in school. Stop DEI. Penridge for educational liberty. Okay. Now, for those of you who don't know what DEI is, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Right? It's an initiative that is happening, kind of like all sorts of places in different parts of the country, right? But it's happening in the Penridge schools too as well. And it's ways like family members and community members are kind of part of the school district, kind of like administration and teachers. They're all looking at better ways to serve the kids in their community, right? Because look, you can no longer like depend on everyone in your community just knowing everybody else, and based upon kind of one specific church or two church backgrounds, and that's all they know, right? No, right? I mean, Percy, Pennsylvania, where I live, right, is a growing community. There's new housing going up all the time, right? And guess what? The people that are moving here are kind of like all over the map. Right? I mean, there's kind of like Latinos moving to the area, some African Americans moving to the area, but there's young white folks moving to the area. There's hipsters moving to the area, right? There's Vespas like buzzing around town every once in a while, that kind of thing, right? So, and there's folks that are some that formerly are kind of moved from Philly, others that are moved from other parts of Pennsylvania, other folks that just move from kind of down the street, right? And so you've got a kind of a range of folks here, and and it's not just everybody's not on the exact same, like, say, economic level, right? Everybody is not kind of white Protestant, right? Everybody is kind of not necessarily kind of like can name the generations of people in their family who lived in Percy for their entire life, right? So, I mean, it's like so many other communities, right? I mean, this is just kind of what happens. And so, like, diversity, equity, and inclusion is one of the ways, right, to ensure that all our kids are doing, regardless of what their racial background is, what their ethnic background is, what their religious background is, right? And the equity one, we want to make sure that kids that are poor are being treated in the same kind of way and are given the resources that they need in order to be kind of successful learners, right? And inclusion, right? To make sure that regardless if you have a disability, right? We don't want you to kind of be pushed to the margins. Right? We want to make sure that you're kind of like included in the community, right? And how do we do that in an effective way, right? Not just by having a class where we can put those students and daycare them for the day, but how do we actually kind of like make our schools responsive places, right? For communities. I'll give you an example. Is that there was a kid in a school where my kids went, and he had he was in a wheelchair, and I hate to say it like this, but I'm going to say it like this. When I was growing up, if there was a kid with the kind of like physical disability that kid had, um, he would have been marginalized in my school that I grew up in. Right? He's this sweet kid, right? And because he couldn't do exactly what all the other kids would do, he would have been marginalized, right? And that would have been an added impact on that kid's life, right? With not having friends, right? Being forced to kind of go in other classrooms while the other kids went out and played, right? Always being reminded that he's different and he's got a disability and he's not like everybody else, so he's not gonna be able to be. That would have been the context growing up. And that was not because like, I would say me and the other kids were kind of would be cruel to that person. I'm not even talking about that level. Of course, those kids have to deal with that regardless. But just in the way that the school day was structured, because, everyone was thinking, we weren't thinking about, different individual kids' needs, Now, my sister, as you've heard me say on the show before, was mentally handicapped. So I kind of had a window into the other side of that, and it was not a pretty picture at that time. So that kind of inclusion is ask that kind of questions, is that how do we make sure that we don't just kind of sacrifice, kids because they don't fit into what we kind of deem to be normal, right? In terms of those disabilities. And if there are kids that have severe disabilities, right? Like, how do we make sure that we have resources in our schools that can actually kind of like meet them, right? And don't just like warehouse them, as it used to be the case, right? That's important. Right. And of course, inclusion also means, for those students who kind of aren't from kind of like the mainstream gender assignments, right? Students who from the LGBTQ communities who are having to kind of grapple with sexuality as they kind of are kind of emerging into kind of adolescence and adulthood. Right. I mean, how do we make sure that we don't send those kids down the road towards like psychological despair and like disproportionately high rates of suicide, right? I mean, that's what the DEI is about, right? DEI commissions are about to kind of, let's consider everybody who's in our community and find ways to respond to that. And of course, educators, again, not all of them, right? But educators by and large are interested in those questions. Right? Because they know that there's ways of kind of like interacting with students, and they know the kind of resources that are involved. And when they don't, guess what? Parents do. So that's who's on this community, thinking about ways of kind of integrating all this stuff and making sure that our schools are, the bastion for kind of like, taking kids and moving them towards kind of democratic citizenship. Right? Because let's remember, these are public schools. Right, the purpose of public schools is not just, and I'll, as they say, academics taught in school are not just kind of like reading, writing, and arithmetic. Right? It's also about history. It's also about science. It's also about truth. It's about narrative. It's about story. Right? It's about who we are. Right? And how we become participants in a democracy. And as our democracy is increasingly multiracial, right? Then how do we prepare kids for that world? Not just for a job, but to be citizens. Not dupes, but citizens, participants. And I'm using the word citizen here really broadly too. I mean, participant in deciding over the direction of the future. Right? People who are not just adapting to what's given to them, but are helping and taking an active part in creating and shaping the future to come. And these DEI initiatives, right, are like, I mean, a really small piece of that. I mean, it'd be like parents coming together and say, how do we make sure that the kids in our neighborhood are getting what they need, right? I mean, it's really simple. But instead, what has happened, right, this is why this right-wing ideologue on the corner of Callow Hill and Branch Road in Percy, that what they're doing is they're kind of taking this thing that we've seen at the national scale, critical race theory, right? Which of course, as Cyril and I talked about on the show on Wednesday, and that Sean and I have talked about repeatedly on the show. Go read Cyril's column, most recent column in the Bucks County Courier-Times, the Intelligencer. He's talking about the critical race theory and looking at some of the history of that stuff. Like critical race theory, just so we're all clear about this, it was a legal academic area of inquiry to look at ways to try to understand how racism persists, right? Despite the legal kind of say, barriers such as like the right to vote have gone away, right? So it's looking at all the ways that kind of legal. That's where kind of it started from, and of course it's bigger than that now. But it's an academic producer, it's an academic kind of intellectual, scholarly kind of pursuit, and it's been around since like the 80s or 90s. I remember reading about it in grad school, like back in the 90s. So this is not new. So that's what critical race theory is. But it sounds interesting to the right wing, and so they latch on it, right? Because somebody probably mentioned it somewhere in some of their chat rooms. And so they do. So they take this thing, critical race theory, which is an academic pursuit. It is not being taught in our schools. Really what they're doing is they're saying, oh my God, our schools are no longer catering only to white kids and are not actively discriminating against black kids, against Latinx kids, right? They might have language programs, right? That might teach our kids that American is not the only language spoken here, right? Things like that. And they're folding that into this notion that, we are increasingly becoming a multiracial democracy. And that white folks are no longer going to be the majority in this country. Right? And they fear the end of white supremacy and their privilege. And that's really what it's about. And they'll do whatever the hell it takes in order to kind of maintain white dominance, maintain white supremacy. So they take this thing, this academic area, thing called critical race theory, and then they kind of say, anytime that you see your kids talking about race, that's the school district, the government, damn teachers, like shoving stuff down your throat, teaching you to be ashamed of yourself and your country, like all that kind of nonsense, right? So that's what they do. And so they take this fear, they take this term critical race theory, and then when they're going into these school boards, because there's these diversity initiatives, the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, they're basically saying that DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, they're saying that DEI is like, the Trojan horse that's going to teach your white kids to hate themselves and hate America, right? That's what that's all about. If you go to these school boards, you listen carefully in these school board meetings, right? The ways that people talk about this, right? That, just parents will talk about this. It's hard to kind of find your way around it, right? And it's hard to kind of think about the ways to kind of go through it, because here's why. Because they'll say things just like that sign says, values, beliefs, and identity should be taught at home, schools for academics, right? And, I'm thinking like, well, if the values you're teaching are home kind of line up with QAnon conspiracy, that Newsmax is a legitimate news source, right? That the moon landing never happened, then you're teaching pretty effed up values at home, folks. And that if anything, what we are required in a democratic country, that is a country that wants to, or at least aspires to, have people govern themselves. It means that people need to be able to kind of critically examine the world and deal with actual facts, actual history, and grapple with the contradictions and the problems and the conflicts in productive ways. Not just kind of swallow like the latest round of right-wing propaganda and say that they're right, or have some freaking preacher kind of like give you all this, these lies about what the hell's going on. Okay. So that's all I'm saying. So that's what they're doing. Right. And, some of these parents really have been kind of like, they've been bamboozled by this, this right wing media sphere, right? Which is telling them that, that they're trying to kind of like educate your kids in ways that are different, or that they're telling you that you're bad parents and you can't do it, right? And that's never what it is. Right? The purpose of what you do at home and what you're teaching in values, beliefs, identities at home, that's one thing, right? But what we're teaching as society to actually be active and critical participants in a democratic culture that's increasingly multicultural and diverse, right? That's the purpose of schooling, not just reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? So we're talking about things like history, right? History is not just like, the great white presidents. It's grappling with the difficulties of our history, of the promise, as well as the genocide, right? As the freedom, as well as the slavery, right? That's what it means to be a critical, citizen in the world. Is to not kind of turn a blind eye to the past, but really kind of internalize it, right? So that we can kind of better grapple with the future, and these folks that want to.